Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be sculpting one of the characters in my D&D party. So, I start by cutting out a length of wire that I'm going to use for the armature. I fold this wire in half and twist it to about 1 centimeter as I normally do when making these armatures. If you're interested to see how I do this, you can check out my video that I did on that should be in the card and at the end of this video. I then go ahead and fold out the legs and add the extra bit of wire for the arms and start to pose the miniature. I can then go ahead and put it on my bottle and file the miniature down a little bit before I add my first layer of green stuff. And now that I've added the first layer, I can start building up the green stuff before I go on and add any details. Speaking of which, as you can see here, I start to add said details. Here I'm adding a little piece of lining that this miniature has around all of his armor, using my rubber sculpting tool to make sure that it's well attached to the miniature, as well as using a craft knife to add in more detail. Moving on, I then start to define the rest of the armor. As you can see here, working on the large kind of belt that this miniature appears to have, as well as adding the end of the tunic that appears to be peeking out from underneath it. If you're wondering, I'm basing all of this off of art and other photos that one of my friends, the person who plays this character, sent me. The armor that this character is wearing is based off of some type of Korean armor from around the 15th or 16th century, which I think is really cool because it's not just your bog standard fantasy armor. I then move on to work on the long tunic that the character wears underneath said armor, which I start doing by adding a bunch of wires that will act as the armature for the material, adding some liquid green stuff so that the material I add on later will actually stick. While I wait for the liquid green stuff to set, I work on the torso of the armor. In the photos I was sent, it appeared to have a scale mail type feel. So after adding a little bit of green stuff, I go in with a craft knife to start doing some hatching into the green stuff. I make sure to do this fairly slowly and taking my time because this is going to be a very key detail in the armor. And when working with these many lines in a detail, you want to make sure that they're very bold and defined so that people know what they're looking at. And in order to make these lines even more defined, once I've got the cross-hatching finished with the X-Acto blade, I go in with a rubber tool and hit those lines again. Following the same process, again making sure to take my time on the other side of the torso. Once I finish with that, I go in and add all these little metal studs that are on the rest of the armor, starting with the largest one in the middle of the belt and then going on to work on the rest of them. At this point, the green stuff that I put on the wires is dry and the wires are nice and set in place in the green stuff, so I go on and add the green stuff that's going to act as the tunic. Here I'm following the same process that I outlined in my video on sculpting capes and cloaks. And if you're interested in watching that, it should be in the card. Wrapping a thin layer of green stuff around the wires, working it with rubber sculpting tools and metal sculpting tools as needed. I then move on to work on the sleeves of the miniature, adding some more green stuff to build up the arms a little bit, and then working on it with a rubber sculpting tool to make sure that it's the right shape. The armor actually ends around the elbows, so here I go in with an X-Acto knife to create more of the scale mail feel that I created before on the main body of the armor. Again, repeating the process that I did for the torso, but taking a little bit of extra care, even more than then, since I'm working on a slightly more rounded and oblong surface to get this texture. Then I go and add more of the lining in the same way I've added around the rest of the mini. After that, I take my craft knife and cut a little bit off of the tunic that I added before because I felt like it was a little bit too long. Once that's done, I continue the same process that I did in my video for sculpting cloaks and clothing, adding on more green stuff and refining down the first layer of material that I added beforehand, working it until I feel like I have the tunic in a place where I like it. I then go back to the torso and add little sleeves over the arms that were in the designs that were sent me. And then I go and sculpt in some boots for the miniature. With some of those smaller details out of the way, I can go in and work on the cloak. I say cloak, but it's more of like a short cape with a large scarf kind of billowy hood. So I go in and add a bunch of folds for the hood and then add a bit of a short cape. While I let that set, I also go work on a hat that the character has, creating the large brim by spreading out a piece of green stuff on an unused miniature base, and then adding a little bit more green stuff to finish it off. I then go in and add a little bit of wire to the scythe that he's going to be holding, and give that a little bit of liquid green stuff. I then move on to sculpt the face, starting with the armature almost of the face as I normally do. I then move on to sculpt the face, which if you're interested in how I do that, I also have a video on that which should be in the card right now. What I was specifically focusing on in this face was I didn't want it to look like another Space Marine. I find that a lot of the faces that I do tend to be just square-jawed, furrowed-browed faces. But this character is supposed to be a high elf, so they wouldn't have that kind of a face. So I was trying to focus on trying to get that feel into it, which I feel like I did to some degree of success, but I feel like the face could have been a little bit better in hindsight. Once I finish with the face, I move on to sculpt the hand that is free on the miniature, and I wanted him to be holding an apple because in our game, he for no apparent reasons has an infinite supply of apples in his hood. And so I jump on the opportunity to let him be holding something, since sculpting a hand holding something is a lot easier than just sculpting a hand holding nothing. After finishing the one hand, I go in and finish the scythe, adding a little bit more green stuff over the wires for the handle, and then go in and add the blade of the scythe itself. Now that the face is set, I can take it off of what I was sculpting it on and go ahead and put it on the miniature with a little bit more green stuff. After which I can work on the final part of this sculpt, that being the hair of the miniature. I actually jumped the gun a little bit on this because I went ahead and spray painted it before showing you the sculpt without any of the primer on it, and also forgot to attach the hat that we made earlier onto the miniature. So I go ahead and put that on its own little painting handle and wire, and go ahead and prime that separately. With that out of the way, I can actually start painting the miniature. I start by painting in the armor with a kind of dusty orange red, and paint the tunic in a cobalt blue, also going to the cape and cloak and hood with that same blue. I then go ahead and paint the flesh tone on the faces and the hands, and add a brown gold to the scale mail that I mentioned before, adding that same color to all of these studs. I also painted the apple and the scythe off camera by just hitting those with some fairly basic colors that you can see here. I then go in and start working on some of the dynamics of the cloak. Here I add a dark blue to the crevices of the tunic, and then add a slightly lighter blue to all the areas in need of a highlight using a glazing technique, which I plan on tackling a little bit of glazing in next week's video, so you can keep your eye out for that. I go in with a lighter silver on the scythe to kind of give the impression that there is a sharpened side to the scythe. And then I can move on to the washes. Here I start with a reddish brown wash that I add to the hands and face. And it's important when you're painting flesh tone to not simply use whatever other wash you're using for the rest of the mini, because then the flesh tones feel very dirty. And all the dark areas you want to be more of a red than a brown. I then simply move on to the rest of the miniature with a brown wash. And here I'm actually using Citadel's Agrax Earth Shade for this. I then go back and touch up any highlights that might have gotten hidden after the wash. I add a couple highlights and a wash to the hat that I primed earlier. And then I go ahead and spend just about the same amount of time that I spent painting the rest of the miniature on trying to get the eyes just right. I then go in with a gold and silver mixture and add highlights to all of the gold parts of the mini. Then I make sure to not forget the hat that I made and stick that onto the back of the miniature with a little bit of super glue. And then as a finishing touch, I add some yellow specks into his hair, since another part of his character is that he always has hay in his hair. And with that, all the mini needs is a base and it's finished. This project was really fun to work on. It was fun going back to sculpting D&D characters since I've been doing a lot of monsters recently. And some of the first miniatures that I started sculpting were characters, so going back to doing that and the different thought process that goes into that was very enjoyable. I will say some of the proportions on this mini are a little bit off. I think his face is too small and his hands are a little bit too big, and so that's kind of disappointing. But it was still very, very fun to sculpt. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.